The bar wasn't loud in a friendly way. It was loud in that restless, edge-of-the-night way, where glasses clink a little too hard, laughter comes a little too sharp, and everyone's balance feels negotiable. And in the corner of that dim, smoke-stained room stood Bruce Lee, not drawing attention, not posturing, just present, nursing a drink and talking quietly, the kind of presence that doesn't demand space but somehow claims it anyway. And a few stools down was the sailor, a mountain of a man, easily 250 pounds, broad shoulders filling out his uniform, voice booming with alcohol-fueled certainty, the kind of certainty that comes when size has solved most problems in your life. And when he overheard someone mention kung fu, he laughed, a deep rolling laugh meant to be heard, and said the words that sealed the moment before it even arrived. Kung fu is just dancing. And he said it with the casual cruelty of someone who's never had to question his own power. Bruce didn't turn at first, didn't react the way people expect a challenge to be met, because Bruce had never been interested in winning rooms with words, and the sailor mistook that silence for agreement or fear, which only made him louder, and he kept talking, mocking the idea of small men and fancy movements, flexing his arms as proof that reality lived in muscle, not technique. And the bar laughed along nervously, because people laugh when they sense conflict but don't want to own it. Bruce finally turned, slowly, eyes calm, expression neutral, and he didn't correct the sailor, didn't argue definitions, didn't explain philosophy. He simply said, evenly, "You don't understand it." And that quiet sentence landed harder than an insult, because it wasn't defensive, it was final. The sailor grinned and took a step closer, looming now, close enough that Bruce could smell the alcohol on his breath. And he jabbed a finger toward Bruce's chest and said something about trying it right now, about seeing how dancing holds up. And Bruce glanced around once, not for backup, not for approval, but to make sure nobody else was in the line of what might happen. And that glance mattered, because it showed intent without anger. The sailor shoved him, not hard enough to knock him down, just enough to assert dominance. And that shove was the only warning anyone got, because the moment it landed, Bruce moved. It didn't look like a fight, it looked like a correction. Bruce stepped inside the sailor's space before the shove had even finished echoing through the man's arms, his body compressing and releasing in one fluid motion, and his strike landed so fast most people didn't register it as a punch, just a sudden absence of breath, a sharp, hollow sound, and the sailor's laughter cut off mid-exhale as his body folded in on itself, knees buckling, hands dropping uselessly. And then he was on the floor, not sprawled dramatically, not knocked across the room, just down, gasping, eyes wide with confusion, like gravity had betrayed him without explanation. The bar went silent in that instant, not shocked screaming silence, but stunned silence, the kind where everyone suddenly becomes very aware of their own heartbeat. And Bruce stood there, relaxed, hands open, breathing steady, not looming over the man, not taunting him, because the lesson wasn't meant to humiliate, it was meant to end the situation. Someone rushed toward the sailor, asking if he was okay, and the sailor could only nod weakly, still trying to draw full breath, because what had hit him wasn't brute force, it was interruption. His nervous system abruptly reminded that size doesn't negotiate timing. Bruce stepped back, already disengaging, already finished, and said calmly, almost kindly, "Kung Fu isn't dancing." And then he turned away, because staying would have turned the moment into spectacle. And Bruce never needed spectacle to make a point. The bartender finally exhaled, the room slowly refilled with sound. But it wasn't the same sound as before. The laughter didn't return. The confidence didn't either, because everyone there had just watched the difference between mass and mastery, between loud belief and quiet reality. The sailor eventually got to his feet, shaken, embarrassed, but wiser in a way that only pain without injury can teach. And he didn't say another word, because words felt inadequate now. What lingered in that bar wasn't fear of Bruce Lee. It was respect for something deeper. The understanding that effectiveness doesn't announce itself, that real skill doesn't look aggressive until it's unavoidable, and that dismissing what you don't understand is often the fastest way to meet it head on. And long after Bruce had left, after the glasses were cleared and the night moved on, the story stayed behind, not as a tale of a fight, but as a warning whispered later to new faces at the bar. That dancing, when done by someone who understands timing, balance, and intent, can end a conversation faster than strength ever could. After Bruce turned away, the silence in that bar lingered longer than the moment itself, stretching out in that uncomfortable way that makes people suddenly aware of how fragile their assumptions are, and no one rushed to laugh it off or turn it into a joke, because what they just seen didn't feel like entertainment. It felt like a rule being enforced by reality. The sailor sat there on the floor for a few seconds longer than necessary, palms flat against the sticky wood, breathing shallow and careful, eyes darting as if the room had shifted slightly out of alignment. And when he finally pushed himself up, his bravado didn't come with him. He stood slowly, testing his balance, touching his chest like he was checking to make sure something vital was still where it belonged. And when his gaze drifted toward the door where Bruce Lee had disappeared, there was no anger in it, no desire for revenge, just confusion mixed with reluctant respect. The bartender broke the spell first, wiping down the counter with deliberate slowness, the way people do when they need a task to anchor themselves back to normal life. And someone muttered something about drinks being on the house for a minute, not as a celebration, but as a way to soften the edge of what everyone had felt. Conversations resumed in fragments, quieter than before, more cautious, and if you listened closely, you could hear the same question being asked over and over in different voices. How did that happen so fast? Nobody could quite agree on what they'd seen, whether it was one punch or several movements that blurred together, whether the sailor had slipped or been struck somewhere specific. But everyone agreed on the outcome, and outcomes are hard to argue with. What most of them didn't realize was that Bruce had been trying to avoid exactly that kind of moment his entire life. He wasn't drawn to bars for fights. He didn't wander around looking for men to prove himself against. And the irony of that night was that the sailor forced a demonstration Bruce would have preferred never to give. Bruce understood street violence in a way most people don't, not as a test of ego, but as a cascade of consequences. And that's why he checked the room before he moved, why his strike had been controlled rather than catastrophic, why the sailor was breathing again instead of being carried out. Bruce's goal wasn't to win, it was to end the situation before it multiplied. Outside, the night air felt cooler, cleaner, and Bruce walked away at an unhurried pace, hands loose at his sides, mind already shifting away from the incident because dwelling on it would have been pointless. He'd learned long ago that street encounters don't validate skill, they only confirm preparation, and he didn't need confirmation. What mattered to him was that nobody else had been hurt, that the lesson had landed without becoming tragedy, and that he could go back to the work that actually interested him, refining movement, stripping away excess, understanding the body under pressure. Stories like that bar incident have a way of growing teeth as they travel, and by the time it reached someone who wasn't there, it usually sounded far more violent than it actually was, with punches flying and bodies crashing into tables, because people need drama to make sense of power. But the truth was quieter and more unsettling. A much larger man had discovered, in the span of a breath, that strength without understanding is brittle, and that realization stayed with him far longer than any bruise would have. He didn't leave the bar that night angry at Kung Fu or embarrassed in a way that hardened into resentment. He left subdued, thoughtful, and those are dangerous emotions in the best possible way because they change behavior. That's the part people miss when they reduce moments like this to legends or barroom myths. The sailor wasn't defeated. He was educated. And education delivered through the body is hard to forget. From that night on, he'd think twice before laughing at something he didn't understand, because laughter had cost him breath, balance, and certainty. And for the people who witnessed it, the lesson was just as sharp, maybe sharper, because they saw how quickly a room can flip, how confidence can evaporate when it's built on assumptions instead of awareness. Bruce never spoke publicly about that incident, not because it was secret, but because it didn't deserve attention. To him, it wasn't a story, It was an interruption, and interruptions are handled, not celebrated. He'd always believed that the highest level of martial skill is invisibility, the ability to move through the world without needing to assert yourself. And nights like that were reminders of how easily misunderstanding drags you into conflict. That's why he emphasized control so relentlessly in his teaching, not control over others, but control over escalation, because real mastery is measured by what you prevent, not by what you destroy. Years later, people would argue about whether the story was true, whether Bruce could really drop a man that size so quickly, and those arguments missed the point entirely. Size disparities don't disappear in real life, they just stop being the only variable that matters. Timing, structure, intent, and a willingness to act decisively without anger change the equation in ways most people never experience until it's too late. Bruce understood that, and more importantly, he respected it, which is why his response that night was precise rather than explosive. If you could have followed Bruce afterward, you wouldn't have seen a man replaying the fight in his head, reliving the strike or the fall. You would have seen someone returning to training the next day with the same quiet intensity he always carried, practicing footwork, shadow boxing, refining the same movements he'd refined 1,000 times before. Because skill isn't something you switch on when challenged, it's something you live inside long before the challenge appears. That consistency is what allowed a moment in a bar to end in seconds, instead of spiraling into chaos. And that's why the phrase Kung Fu is just dancing sounds different when you've seen what dance looks like when it's backed by understanding. Dance is rhythm, timing, balance, and intention expressed through movement, and when those elements are applied without waste, without hesitation, they don't look pretty, they look inevitable. The sailor laughed because he saw motion without context. Bruce responded by showing context without explanation. Long after that night faded into memory, the lesson remained intact, passed quietly from person to person, not as a warning about Bruce Lee, but as a warning about arrogance. There's missing something because it doesn't look like what you expect is one of the oldest mistakes humans make. And it's one the body often pays for before the mind catches up. Bruce didn't create that lesson, he just embodied it briefly, in a bar that forgot how to be loud for a few seconds. And that's why, when people talk about Bruce Lee's real fights, the most honest stories don't end with triumph or domination. They end with silence, with someone lying still long enough to understand what just happened, and with Bruce already gone. Because the point was never to stay and be admired. The point was to restore balance, then move on, leaving behind nothing but a memory sharp enough to change how people think the next time they're tempted to laugh at what they don't understand.